Oi, mate, can you turn the vocals up a bit? They're not loud enough?
Sure, yeah, they're about as loud as I can get them, but I'll do my best.
Ah, cheers, mate. I do a bit of engineering myself, actually, you know. Yeah, it's quite easy, really, isn't it?
Yeah, sure. Anyway, I'm a bit busy right now, and I mean, it's too loud really to have a proper conversation. We can chat after the show, maybe?
Oh, excuse me, mate. I'm stood right at the back of the room with my mates, round the corner at the bar, and the bass isn't quite loud enough. Can you bring the bass up a little?
Okay, maybe try standing nearer the PA system?
Oh, yeah, but I'm trying to catch up with my mates, you see? That's why we're at the back by the bar and, you know, we're having a drink. So can you just bring the bass up a bit more for me? Hello, mate. Sorry to bother you. My son plays guitar in the band, and his guitar isn't quite loud enough. Can you turn it up a little?
Alright, where are you stood?
Yeah, I'm at the back of the room.
Ah, okay. Right, well, his guitar is actually quite loud on stage, so I've not got much of it going through the PA system. Otherwise, it would be way too loud for people at the front, and I'm trying to balance things out for the whole of the room, so I'd suggest maybe just standing a little closer to the PA system.
So if you've ever worked in live sound, you'll likely have encountered scenarios like these. And I wanted to talk about in this video whether or not it's okay to go up to an engineer during a show and ask them to turn something up, or, you know, ask them to change something about the sound that you're hearing. This is a difficult question, and I think there are arguments on both sides, and neither's really right or wrong. I think a lot of it is down to the differing perspectives of a working professional, and then your average person who, understandably, you know, they don't understand the nuances of live sound and actually how challenging things can be with making a mix sound good. If you're at a show and the vocals don't seem quite loud enough, you're just going to hear that the vocals sound a bit quiet, and naturally you'll want them to be louder, and you might not really think a whole lot of going up to the engineer and making a simple request like that. It's a very subjective matter, and I think one that everybody's going to have a different opinion on. But I think for the most part, for people, engineers who are working in live sound, nobody really wants to be told how to do their job, especially by somebody who doesn't actually do that job and quite likely doesn't really know what they're talking about. And I think that's fair enough. As an engineer, I think most of us would say mid-show, we're in the middle of doing our job. We're trying to focus on doing our job, or at least we should be if we're doing our job properly. But assuming that we are a good engineer and we actually care about the job we're doing, we're focused on our work, and then we get somebody come up to us and complain about the sound. Having somebody critique and essentially criticize your work whilst you're in the midst of doing your work can be kind of a challenging thing to deal with. We're just there trying to get on with our jobs, and in most cases trying to do the best job we can. So having somebody come up to you and say that something isn't good enough, essentially, can be quite challenging. It's difficult to respond to as well, especially when the answers usually aren't something that that person would understand. And also you're trying to deliver that message over very loud music where it's difficult to have an actual proper conversation. So often we resort to, you know, just giving a thumbs up if somebody asks for the vocal to be turned up or whatever it might be. And, you know, we'll just give a thumbs up and a smile, even if we know actually what they're asking either isn't possible or maybe is unreasonable. It's not as simple as just turning the vocal up. Quite often with vocals, which tends to be the thing that people complain about the most at shows, quite often it's down to intelligibility. To your average person who doesn't really understand the nuances of sound and of acoustics and all these things, they won't really understand that intelligibility and volume are two different things. And so they'll hear the vocal and they won't be able to pick out every lyric, hear the vocal in the way that they want to hear it, nice and clearly, and they'll just assume that it's a case of turning it up, which sometimes that may be the way to achieve that. Sometimes it's a case of EQ, sometimes it's the microphone, you know, it might not be very well matched to the singer, or just the amount of bleed on stage. If the drummer's absolutely wailing on the kit. You're in a small venue, a small stage. The vocal mic is right in front of the drum kit, and you've got a really quiet singer. The engineer is often fighting a losing battle. If somebody doesn't enunciate very well, if they're not projecting that much, it's going to be a lot harder to get the vocal to a level where you can pick out every lyric. A microphone is not really selective with what it picks up, even though you do have different pickup patterns, so cardioid, omni, figure eight, and they all pick up sound in different ways, but a microphone isn't selective in what it hears, so it's going to hear everything on that stage. Whatever's closer to it is going to pick up more of, so it will pick up more of the singer. But if you've got a load of volume from the drum kit right near the mic, it's also going to be picking up all of that. So as you turn the vocal up, you're also turning up all that bleed from the drum kit. It's not as simple as just turning the vocal up. Things aren't kind of isolated in their own pockets, which I think your average person is just going to assume that they are, and that you can just infinitely turn the vocal up without any sort of detriment. And of course, there's feedback as well that we have to think about. The more you turn a microphone up, the more likely it is that you're going to get feedback issues. There are all these things that make it not as simple as it might be in your average person's head. But I do think it's fair as your average person to make those assumptions because you don't really understand everything that is involved in doing live sound. And as a punter, you're paying money to go to a gig, and you are going to have certain expectations. If I go to a show as a punter and the sound is a bit rubbish, I can't really hear certain things clearly, I am going to be a little bit annoyed or disappointed. If you do make that decision to go up to the engineer during a show and ask for them to change something about the sound, there are ways to go about it. Primarily just being polite and nice. It never gets anyone anywhere to be rude or disrespectful to somebody. Stands to reason that that's not going to be the best way to achieve the kind of response that you want from the other person. That's just going to make the engineer annoyed and defensive, understandably, because you're coming up to them out of nowhere and suddenly criticizing them. I've had some people come up to me during shows and be absolutely horrible, swearing at me, attacking me verbally. And I am not here to take abuse. And that's something that I will always stand by for myself and any other engineer, anyone working in the live events industry, or in any other kind of people-facing role, hospitality jobs. We're not here to take abuse from people. If you have an issue with something, that's fair enough. But as soon as it gets personal and you start attacking somebody personally, that's not okay. At the end of the day, we are just people doing a job, and we want to go into work, get our heads down, do our work, get that job done, and go home at the end of the day. Working in live sound, I definitely feel lucky to be doing what I do, and I enjoy the work that I do, but ultimately at the end of the day, it is still just a job. I think some people assume working in a job that you're passionate about and you generally enjoy, that you're going to be super invested in it all the time, which a lot of the time I am. But there are days that I go in and I'm not all engines firing, working at 110%. And that's totally fine. It tends to be the case that in terms of pay with live sound engineering, until you get to the really high levels of events, so you're talking your touring level work, arena shows, stadium shows, that's going to pay pretty well. That will be quite high paying. But for your small local venues, the engineers doing those jobs, particularly the in-house engineers, those jobs don't tend to pay that much. They pay pretty much like your average hourly wage, maybe a little bit above that. And so being completely honest, I don't really blame an engineer if I see them there and they're just coasting and, they are the stereotype of the grumpy sound engineer. I can see where it comes from and how people end up in that position, because quite often there's a lot of nonsense that engineers have to deal with. We're dealing with, say you've got a 3-4 band bill for a local show, you're the local sound guy at the venue doing sound for all those bands, you've got to deal with all those people's egos. A lot of people who will think they're right about everything and often, maybe are not being that nice or polite to the engineer. And then you get punters coming up during the show giving the engineer grief as well. It can be a lot to contend with and can be enough to put somebody in a bad mood and make them want to just go home. So yeah, at the same time, majoritively I'd say the bands and artists that I work with so many lovely people who are very respectful and courteous. A lot of gig goers as well are very respectful and courteous. Also, you still get the odd ones, particularly when alcohol's involved as well. That's another thing. You know, people have a few drinks, which actually affects your hearing as well, but that's a whole other thing. People have a few drinks and they think they know best, and there's something that they're not happy about, and they decide to go up to the sound guy and take it out on them, or sound woman. So yeah, it's tough. I was working one event a while ago now, and this is my opinion, but the sound was totally fine. It sounded very good. It was in a small, like 150 capacity room, small PA system, but the sound was good. The coverage of the room was pretty good. But somebody came up to me who, if I remember right, they were the parent of the bass player in one of the bands playing. They said, so I'm paraphrasing here, but they said that the vocal wasn't loud enough, the bass wasn't loud enough, and then they said that I'm effing up the sound and that I'm not any good at my job. At which point, if they'd just come up to me and said, hi, you know, I'm the parent of the bass player in the band, not that that really bears any relevance, but you know, whatever. I feel like the bass isn't loud enough and the vocals aren't loud enough. I respect, you know, you're just doing your job, but I just wanted to come up and tell you this nicely. I'll leave you to it. But yeah, just so you're aware, I think these things could be louder. Do with that what you will, kind of thing. If I just said something along those lines, just generally were polite and didn't start swearing at me. As soon as somebody starts swearing at me, and as soon as this person started swearing at me, I said, look, you've been rude to me. I'm not here to take abuse. Please go away and leave me to do my job. And I said it as politely as I could, but sometimes you just have to put people in their place. I recently had somebody come up to me at a show and complain about the sound. And this was in a venue where, if you imagine, you have a point source system, so 2 single tops and 2 subs under the stage. The tops are flown, so they're hung from the ceiling. It's not really enough to cover the size of this particular space. You also have a bar to the side and a whole kind of area where the PA system doesn't really kind of cover that space. The sound does reach that area, but it's not the direct sound from the PA. Obviously, if you're stood in front of the PA, it's going to sound very different to being to the side of it or being behind it. The tops themselves are actually flown a bit too far forward from the stage, depending on where you're stood in this venue. If you're stood somewhere off to the side near the bar, nearer the front, you'll actually end up essentially behind the PA system. I asked where they were stood, and they pointed out where they were stood with their group of friends, and lo and behold, they were stood to the side behind the PA system. They were complaining specifically about the vocals not being clear enough. And so I said to them, look, you know, I understand where you're coming from, but actually where you're stood, if you move kind of nearer to the centre of the room, you'll be able to hear things a lot more clearly, and that's where I'm mixing things for. I can't necessarily mix to make the sound ideal for every single pocket of the room. In any room, there's always going to be sort of dead spaces where the sound coverage isn't great, or maybe acoustically, like there's a null in the low end, so you'll get a dip in the low end and the bass won't sound as strong there. I've had that one before. Somebody come up to me and say, oh, I can't hear the bass guitar enough, or I can't hear the kick drum enough, and I've asked where they're stood, and again, lo and behold, they're stood exactly where I know there's a null in the low end. So I say to them, well, look, you know, if you take a few steps to the left or the right, or back or forward, you'll be out of this null. But that's hard to explain to somebody who doesn't understand acoustics, obviously. And this is one of the challenging things with dealing with people with issues with the sound. The fact is, your average person going to a show is probably going to be assuming that the gist of what the sound engineer does is that they have volume control, a fader for each individual element of the mix, each member of the band, and they can turn those things up or down in complete isolation to each other without sort of any detriment. So if you want the guitar louder, you can just turn the guitar up, and if you want it down, you can turn it down, and so on for any of the members of the band. We know as sound engineers that it's not as simple as this, and that there are a whole myriad of other things at play, primarily room acoustics. So originally, pre-amplified sound, we built live performance spaces like theatres and auditoriums with acoustics in mind, and we actually used the reverberation of a space to amplify sound, because reverb is a natural amplifier. It amplifies things at the cost of intelligibility and clarity. Reverb often has the effect of muddying up the sound. If you think of like a reverb effect, the dry, direct sound of a vocal versus a reverberant sound, a reverb effect on a vocal, the dry vocal is a lot clearer than the reverb. And it's the same with natural reverb. It tends to have the effect of muddying things up. So it amplifies things naturally, but at a cost. Once we brought in amplified sound with PA systems, interestingly, it's like a lot of people stopped thinking about room acoustics, which is silly really when you think about it, because the room acoustics really sets the bar for how things are going to sound. Once you start amplifying sound and pumping sound out into a room, that amplified sound is going to excite the room. And that sound is then going to reverberate within that space, and then that reverb naturally amplifies things. And so you have to then push more volume through the PA to overcome the reverberation that's being caused by that sound happening, pumping out into the room, alongside your actual stage volume. So just the volume of the unamplified sound of things on stage. And most music venues now are not acoustically treated in any way. We tend to just take pre-existing buildings, chuck some PA in it and hope for the best. A crowd of people in a room, people themselves, act as natural acoustic treatment. People soak up sound themselves. And so if you have a room, a sold out show, a room full of people, that will help a lot. We sort of rely on having a packed out room of people to make things sound good in the room. A lot of sound engineers will say this to a band or to a touring technician with a band during sound check when the room's empty. They'll go, "Oh, don't worry, it sounds better when there's people in here." And it's an odd thing really that we rely on that. We don't build spaces with sound in mind anymore really. There are exceptions to that, especially in Europe, from my experience, do tend to acoustically treat a space, but in the UK it's very uncommon for that to be the case. And with your little bars and your sort of non-music venues but places that put on live music, they're typically not going to have any kind of sound treatment in place. They're not really optimized for sound, but they're putting live music on. So we have that to contend with as engineers. We also are at the mercy of what type of PA is installed in a venue. As engineers, typically we're not bringing in our own PA systems. We're working with either whatever the venue has installed or a system that's being installed specifically for that event and hired in. But as the engineer ourselves, we're not the ones paying for and supplying and putting in a PA system in a venue. So we are at the mercy of that a lot of the time. At your higher level of events, it's going to be more common that PA systems will be well installed. If you need things like delays, fills around a space, or with outdoor events, you need fills for coverage for people further back in an audience. Those sort of things will be taken care of, but this gets less common the lower you go down in the chain of music venues. So once you get to smaller spaces, this becomes less common. And typically in small venues, you have what's called a single point source PA system, where it's just one stack of PA. So the sound is firing from one single place, which means that for an audience, people who are closer to those speakers, to that PA system, it's going to be louder. as opposed to people who are further back. This is just how sound works. If you take any speaker, so your home stereo at home, if you put your ear, I mean, I wouldn't advise this if you play music loud, but if you put your ear close to a speaker playing music, and then, you walk further away, you go in the other room, it's quieter. To contend with that, we came up with line array systems, which is usually a flown array of speakers that are set at varying angles. So you'll have seen these in lots of mid to large size venues. These systems are often quite expensive, so they're often out of reach for smaller, more grassroots local music venues. They're a splay of speakers which are angled. What this achieves is that sound from each cabinet, each single cabinet, is firing out at a certain angle. So the very top speakers are firing back the furthest to reach the back of the audience. The ones at the bottom of the array are angled down more towards the people at the front. And this allows you to achieve an even distribution of sound at an even volume level. So you don't need to hit the people near the front with more volume in order to get enough volume at the back of the room. When you're dealing with point source systems where you only have a single set of speakers firing out to the audience, this is a challenge for an engineer. They're trying to balance out the sound in order to be optimal, not be too loud for people at the front and not be too quiet for people at the back. So if somebody comes up to the engineer and complains about things being a bit too quiet, but they're stood at the back of the room, that might be because in order to get things loud enough for the back of the room, it would be too loud at the front. So it's very much a balancing act for the sound engineer. And you could argue that that's because the PA that's been put in is inadequate for the room, but the reality is that most venues don't necessarily have the means to install a line array. Or you can employ things like fills or delays, which are additional speakers which will be placed around a room where there might be gaps in the sound to fill out the sound more, but without. The idea is that you're not really adding additional volume. So it means that you can keep your main speakers at a more acceptable level. People who are off to the side more, you have some delays installed. If there's a balcony overhead that's blocking the main hang of speakers or something, you might have some delays the other side of the balcony so that people are still getting enough sound and that they can hear things clearly with clarity, but without having to turn that main PA system up too much for the people that are stood closer to it. So delays and fills can be used, but those have to be set up correctly. There's things like time alignment that we have to consider, which is a whole other thing I won't go into in this video. But basically the gist of it is that sound engineers have a lot to contend with. There's natural physics and science behind how sound works, and we can't fundamentally change that. And actually amplified sound kind of introduces a lot of challenges because we're almost trying to sort of cheat the way sound naturally works. If you think about your arena shows, those are often big reverberant rooms with lots of hard reflective surfaces everywhere, and people often talk about the sound not being that good at arenas, and this is often why. The drummer hits the kick drum and it's got this huge reverb tail on it. That's because you're just in these large, reverberant, untreated spaces. And most music venues were not really built from the ground up to accommodate good sound acoustically in terms of the room. I'd be interested to hear what you guys think. Other live sound engineers out there, what your opinion is on this kind of thing. Gig goers, what do you think about this? Do you think you should be able to go up to an engineer and ask them to change something about the sound? I'm kind of torn on it. I generally say to people, it's just not a good idea to go up to an engineer and to ask them to change things, because I think most of the time, it's subjective and really is your opinion. The sound engineer can only mix to their own set of ears. And, they're trying to do that in a way that is going to give what they think is going to be the most balanced sound, the most accommodating for everybody in the room. But they can only do things to their ears. And if one single person comes up to them during a show and asks them to change something, well, that's just one person. You know, if the whole audience was coming up to them and saying, I think the bass needs to go up or go down, then probably majoritively, you know, if the whole audience is saying that, then it probably does need to go up or down. But when it's just one person saying it, as an engineer, you kind of go, well, you know, that's just your opinion. And also that may be based entirely on where you're stood, which may be where there's a null in the bass or whatever. Certain areas of the room, there'll be a bit of dip in the low end, so you'll get less bass. And that's another thing we have to contend with. So that, you know, there are so many things. And yeah, generally, I think it's just not a good idea to go up to an engineer and ask them to change things, because no matter how polite you might try to be, I think the likelihood is it's going to come across in the wrong way. And also, they're in the middle of a show, they're in the middle of doing their job. It's better just to leave them to do their job. Chances are, if something is wrong with the sound, the vocals aren't loud enough or whatever, the engineer is going to be aware of it, and they're either going to be trying to fix it, or they've already tried, but it's just not really possible, and they're just doing the best they can. So you coming over and saying, oh, can you bring the vocals up, is not really helping anything. I can't think of any occasion where somebody's ever come up to me and they said, oh, I think this could be louder or quieter, and I've gone, oh yeah, I didn't realise that. Oh yeah, I should turn that thing up. I'm pretty much always aware of what needs to be quieter or louder, and I know whether or not that's even possible. And if it is possible, I'll be doing whatever I can to make that work. To counter that, I have actually had some instances, one I can think of, where a producer for the band that was playing, so they had produced one of their records or something, came up to me and actually very politely said, oh, hey, you know, nice to meet you. I'm actually the producer for this band in the studio. I think the synths could be a little louder in the mix, but otherwise you're doing a great job. Sounds wicked. But yeah, if you wouldn't mind bringing the synths up a little bit, you know, because I kind of mixed it to what I thought was appropriate, but then telling me that, not that necessarily the live sound needs to sound exactly like the record. You know, I think in a lot of cases the live sound should sort of be its own thing, but I don't necessarily have any aversion to aiming for a similar sound to the band on record. That person coming up to me and saying that, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, sure. You know, they obviously got a pretty good idea of what the band wants to sound like, so the synths probably do need to come up a bit, and I brought them up a bit and I went, yeah, you know, that sounds good. It kind of sounded good either way, but I respected that person's opinion that was obviously reflective of what the band wanted as well, I'm sure. They did it the right way if ever you are going to go to an engineer and ask them for some sort of change in the sound. They did it the right way. They complimented me on the mix and they were polite. That's the way to do it. I still don't necessarily think you should do it because it is more than likely still going to backfire, I think. But if you are going to do it, compliment them. Go up to them, you know, introduce yourself, say, hey, don't keep it brief because you are in the middle of a loud gig most likely, but go up to them and say, hey, oh, sounds great. I just think this could come up a bit or this could come down. But anyway, I'll leave you to it. Keep it nice and brief. Tell them they're doing a great job, even if they're not. That's how you're going to get them on side, if you are going to get them on side at all. Anyway, I'll leave it there. But let me know what you think in the comments. Both my fellow live sound engineers and any gig goers, I'd love to hear thoughts on both sides. Subscribe to the channel if you're new here. I'd really appreciate that. That helps me out. I'm trying to grow things here on YouTube. Give the video a like. That also helps me out. And I'll see you guys again in the next one.